Hello and welcome to this new series here on our YouTube channel. My name is Guy and you're watching Game Masters Play. What is Game Masters Play? Game Masters Play is an idea that we've come up with here on the channel where we will take different role-playing systems, whether they're old or new, and give them to 3 or 4 or 5 game masters who are either influencers or who are very experienced game masters in their own rights. Give them these new role-playing systems for 1 month where they get to read through the rules, create characters, create adventures, and then they actually get to play in an adventure. And then we give you our feedback on that role-playing system in the form of 4 videos. The first video introduces the role-playing system and the ideas and mechanics behind it and why GMs, DMs, and narrators would find the system interesting to play. The second episode looks at why players would want to play the role-playing system, and so often is the case that players might be reluctant to adopt a new role-playing system or vice versa, and we look at the reasons why one should or should not necessarily adopt the particular RPG under question. The third episode is a live play, a complete session, 3 or 4 hours long, where all of the game masters get together and actually play through an adventure that attempts to utilize the mechanics presented in that particular RPG to maximum effect. And then finally, the fourth video is our actual review video, where the game masters give their final thoughts on the actual RPG. Now, we are trying to keep this fairly impartial, although each episode is sponsored by the respective RPG's publisher. We have devised 25 questions which must be answered by each of the game masters that have participated in the play. The questions are not necessarily open for interpretation, they are simple yes or no answers. Some of the questions range from, are the rules easy to understand, to, are there lots of options for character creation or little options for character creation? Does the material allow for freedom of narrative expression, or is it restrictive, preventing the DM or GM from running games as they so choose? Is the material available online? Is there support for it? Are there downloads? What are its compatibility options? And so much more. All of those questions will be presented in the final show with the final scores tallied, giving the RPG a GMP score. And that score is derived from the answers of all of the game masters who participated in the actual game itself. So our hope, our goal with Game Masters Play is to provide you with insight into role-playing systems, not just from one perspective, not just from my perspective, but from multiple perspectives of different GMs, giving you insight into how the mechanics work and how the game runs, and actually being able to watch how the game runs to decide on whether or not this is an RPG for you to adopt or not. I should say that the goal of GMP is not to prove better or worse role-playing systems out there. It's important to remember that no matter what the score might be, no matter what the opinions of the GMs who participate might be, each group, each player, each GM needs to find systems that work best for them. And that might mean that something that scores poorly in GMP is actually right for you. After all, most of these systems have gone through pretty rigorous testing and play testing and have got thumbs up from someone somewhere. And so each one has, at its very worst, an option for you to learn from and to grow from as a game master or as a player. And that should be something that sits in the back of your mind when you're watching these reviews. Another thing that's also important is to look and see the composition of the people that we've assembled for each of these, because it will vary from game to game, and to identify whether you agree with their particular play style or whether you don't. That will obviously skew the results. Nonetheless, I hope that you enjoy what we are presenting here in Game Masters Play. To kick us off, we've got a wonderful product from Cubicle 7, Adventures in Middle-earth. Now, Middle-earth, of course, has been something that has been explored extensively in movies and in books, and now an upcoming Amazon TV series. So it's a rich, rich environment for us to play in. What sets it apart from other settings, in brief, is that it's a fairly low magic fantasy setting. There is magic around, but it's not easily accessible. I won't go into too much detail because, well, that's what the rest of the video is about. Suffice it to say that we played this and had a lot of fun doing so. It is a very different take on 5th edition, which is the core mechanic that it runs off of. And let me just say, it certainly did not feel like we were playing 5th edition for the better. It certainly felt like a unique experience. So stick around as Game Masters Play presents Adventures in Middle-earth.
Adventures in Middle-earth. What is this role-playing game all about? Well, the title in this one is very specific and kind of sums it up. It's about playing adventures in Middle-earth. So if you're a Tolkien fan, if you enjoyed The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, you're probably going to really enjoy the source material for this particular game. It's written really well from those points of view.
For me, it's all about playing in the world of the Lord of the Rings, and it's amazing that there's an RPG, specifically an RPG system and an RPG layout and mechanics that allow you to do that, because I personally love the Lord of the Rings and I love Middle-earth.
I feel like sometimes that is a struggle with a lot of new dungeon masters. Like they get excited, like they either watch like Critical Role or hell, How to Be a Great GM with Dead Aussie Gamer, some of his games, or with a lot of the other GMs that are Joy Quest, but other all of the dungeon masters that people watch on I guess it's technically on TV, but like on YouTube or Twitch. They're excited. They get down. They're like, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get a bunch of players. And then it's like, and what do I do? I want to put them on an adventure. Maybe they'll go fight a monster. But man, what would the monster be? Or where should I go? What should the world be like? Oh, God. And sometimes they kind of get stuck. Hell, I did this to myself, where you would get stuck in a situation where you're kind of possibly overcomplicating it, adding too many new and scattered ideas that don't really connect the dots. While with something like this, this really helps you put everything together.
This RPG really focuses on getting that flavor of Middle-earth and really finding an authentic tabletop expression of the flavor and the mise-en-scène and the tone that is encapsulated within The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
What I think this role-playing game is about more than anything is nostalgia. If you grew up with the world of Tolkien, then you are in the right place. This role-playing game is just dripping with lore and tidbits and all kinds of flavor that really help bring to life the world of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
So the core mechanics of the game are D&D 5e, or that is to say the OGL, the Open Gaming License. So if your players are familiar with that, they're going to have a very, very easy time picking up the core mechanics of Lord of the Rings. Combat works pretty much in the same way, although there are some very cool and interesting crunchy flavor rules for things like special weapons, which I love.
Things break down to the adventuring phase, the fellowship phase, and the journey phase. The journey is kind of like a skill challenge that the whole party has to undergo, and depending on how well you do, really good things can happen or really bad things can happen.
Going on a journey with your fellowship, with your party, where you have, you've got your guide, you've got your scout, you've got your hunter, you've got these different people with like different specific tasks that kind of like go from like point A to point C, where you've got, point A, you have your task. Point B, you go on your journey, facing a bunch of different encounters that could be either really bad or some that are not so bad, that have a little bit of good in them, but overall, it's kind of a bad situation to be in. And then at the end, when you either find your big bad or your sanctuary, and then you have the rival role at the end of it that could be either really harsh or only a little harsh.
When we look at most role-playing games, we completely ignore that. It's all about just, sure, you arrive, you're at full strength, you've got no fatigue, you're perfectly fine. Whereas in this, pretty much if you have a bad run and your journey to your location is quite terrible, you could arrive with barely any steam. Even getting to the adventure end where we were, the end of the journey, we were exhausted, and it made everything that much more difficult. And that was the first step out of 6. So, I mean, yeah, that was that.
The idea that the shadow is an omnipresent sort of force that's pressing down and becoming, it's going to get darker and darker and darker and darker and darker and darker through the mechanical actions of the wisdom saves and gaining shadow points until you succeed.
Instead of alignment defining your character, it was you had to play your character as it were, and as you took actions, as you went to certain places that were strong in the shadow influence, this entity started to seep into you with this evil power. And the worse you got, the more dark your character became. And we get to see a lot of that corruption in some of the Lord of the Rings novels, and of course the Lord of the Rings movies, as well as The Hobbit, of course. And I think that's, for me, one of the most interesting things.
The fellowship phase, which is the sort of, I guess it's downtime, which need a little bit of explanation. They're very interesting, and I think that they're a great way for beginner DMs to really get a feel for the mechanic of an adventure. That is to say, a journey, an adventure, and then a downtime afterwards, which is a great space also for players to do character development. And that is something that I think is often neglected, essentially, that people forget that their characters need time off for, development and learning and these kinds of things. Like, you can't just adventure 24/7. It's like, I wouldn't want to.
I think when we look at shortfalls and pitfalls of the system, there is the initial one, which any genre-specific, setting-specific role-playing game is going to struggle with, is the lack of knowledge. Oh, I don't know Lord of the Rings. I'm not familiar. Are orcs green in this campaign? I don't know the difference between Saruman and Sauron. I know personally I was confused for a long time with that. I could have read the book and I got a bit lost. I was young. So there's always going to be the pushback in terms of familiarity with the system. I don't think that is something that necessarily needs to be too much of an issue. The books are packed full of enough lore that you would be able to have fun and engage in playing within the game, but also not too much lore that you feel like you're being burdened with this massive amount of data that you suddenly have to remember.
Really, the strengths of this system are its weaknesses. One, it's built off of Dungeons and Dragons. If you do not like 5e D&D, you may not like this game at all. If you do not like Tolkien, you may not like this game at all. If you do not like low magic settings, you're not going to like this. If you don't like dark and grittier settings, you're not going to like this either. This is a low magic fantasy game built off of Middle Earth and the Tolkien stories from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. That's what it does really well. If you don't like those things, this game is not going to be for you.
Some of the limitations of the system are probably its reliance on the journey system as a mechanical thing rather than a narrative role-playing thing. Sometimes I think that the journey system would need to be heavily customized and worked on by a GM, coming up with their own kind of ideas and more sort of streamlined journeys rather than using the system in the book. Because if you roll the same dice for, let's say, some of the problems or embarcations and things like that, maybe the players undertake 2 small journeys and they roll the same number of dice. They might feel a little bit samey and they might not be customized to the area that you're in. So they're a good baseline, but they need to be worked on a lot by the GM. So I think that system is a great base, but it should be more obvious or explained in a lot more detail that you really do need to work on that in order to fit that more naturally into a long-running campaign.
I feel like there could be some house rules that can make either make the penalties not so harsh, but otherwise, but it's still there if you want like a really intense game.
I would say that players who haven't done their preparation, who haven't read the rulebook carefully, are going to be very surprised by some of the mechanics in there. Cubicle 7's put a lot of emphasis on having different phases, so 3 phases of play. The journey phase is highly mechanized to make it feel like a Lord of the Rings journey, and there are different roles there. So as long as your players know that, you'll be fine. If they rock up to the table and have not prepared, you've got a lot of explaining to do in session 1.
Probably my biggest criticism mechanics-wise has to be the skills. There are 4 new skills in the game. There is lore, traditions, shadow lore, and riddles. Of these 4, I don't think 3 of them are necessary, honestly. The game is a 5e skin, which means that they have already implemented a lot of the 5e skills. I think rather than separating out lore and traditions, keeping history doesn't do anything wrong. I think being able to consolidate your skills so that people are able to, just enjoy their proficiencies would work way better than having to split it apart for apparently some reason. In addition, I think riddles as well was kind of redundant. While I understand that riddles are a huge part of the Tolkien lore, I don't see why you needed a new skill instead of, say, using insight for that. Shadow lore, I can kind of give some credit to. Shadow lore is an obscure lore, something that is not well known, and something that you would really need to do a very specialist amount of research to find out about. So I can give Shadow lore. Shadow lore is a cool mechanic, and I think people who take proficiency in it should be rewarded. But the other 3, again, I think they already existed.
You can play a lot of different types of games with these rules, and although it is based in Middle-earth, there is oftentimes pushback from people going, oh, my knowledge of Middle-earth is not very good. I don't know a palantir from a palindrome. Pushback. But I wouldn't look at it like that. I would look at it as, yes, there's a lot of lore that relates to Middle-earth, but at the same time, the fundamental mechanics, the idea of plotting out a journey, of the difficulties of that journey, the fellowship phase at the end, how to handle audiences with these very powerful figures, those kinds of things, I think that's something definitely to be taken into account, and not to be restricted necessarily to just Middle-earth. You could play other systems, you could play other spaces, you could play other ages. You don't have to just play in Middle-earth. So it's a very interesting, again, dark setting that I think will carry across. I could see this working very well in a King Arthur type of setting, in an Arthurian legend sort of space. So it could work really well there as well, and I like that.
So some of the things that really make playing Adventures in Middle-earth cool is the fact that if you're fans of the source material, if you wanted to run or play a Tolkien style adventure, this is going to cover that for you. You're going to get to use hobbits and elves and dwarves and men, just like in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. If you want to play in that grittier setting where things are a little more deadly and it's not high magic but low fantasy instead, you're going to really find this setting cool and a lot of fun.
And there's so much detail and love that's been put into it, and even the wording in the books is very similar to Tolkien sort of language, and it's very sort of musical and lyrical, and there's a lot of really cool like little quotes and stuff in the book. So it's a great book if you love Lord of the Rings. It's really cool.
You can meet Gandalf, you can go fight Smaug, you could visit Hobbiton, you go to Mordor, you could write your own adventure. The settings are cool. The art in the book is also gorgeous. Really gets you in that Tolkien vibe. The classes also have interesting different dynamics, even though they are close cousins to the 5th edition class options, but there are still like a lot of unique options from the classes that really bring this game out. Like the Scholar, for one, is their particular game, because they can gain secrets or important lore from the Lore Master. Also, that's a really cool name, the Lore Master. Love it. But it could literally be the difference between life or death. Like with the warrior, you can have your own, like your weapon has like a birthright to it. It has its own name with a bunch of different abilities. They're just all really cool. And I do like that.
It uses the base of 5th edition, and it then adds in its own mechanics. And I like that when RPGs say, okay, we're going to use a D20 system, we're going to use 5th edition because people are familiar with it, because it's accessible to a lot of people, but we're going to add in our own flavors. And they weren't afraid to do that. So some skills are being swapped out to add in more flavorful skills that sit better with the setting. And then they've added in these mechanics of the journey mechanic. And then the fellowship mechanic, which actually happens after the adventure. And I must say, I quite like that.
One big one is the shadow. I thought the shadow was the coolest. Being able to, instead of look at evil and good as these two ends of a giant scale, instead being this evil force, this entity that begins to exert its influence upon the world, and the shadow will get you if morality begins to slip, as darkness invades your mind. That for me was so cool. I adored that particular mechanic.
So this is super cool, of course, if you are a Tolkien fan, if you have read and loved the Lord of the Rings books, as so many of us, like Glorious Geeks, did when we were kids. It really throws you back into that feeling, and it does feel very authentic. It feels like you are playing within the Middle-earth space.
Well, there you have the conclusion of the first part of this series, where we looked at adventures in Middle-earth from the Game Master's perspective, from the Lore Master's perspective. Lots of positives, some negatives. Is it the game for you? Well, if you're a player, next week we're going to look at the character creation and all of the processes that go along with that. And that may give you some more insight whether or not this is the game for you. I think what all of the game masters, though, were adamant on was that if you liked Lord of the Rings, if you liked all of the stuff that Tolkien did, then this is definitely the role-playing game for you. Let's find out next week, though, whether this is the role-playing game for you if you're a player.